The house sold for $218,000. Dorothy saw the listing herself, folded into the real estate section of the Sunday paper that still arrived wet on the driveway every weekend, because Frank had never canceled the subscription and she had never thought to. Her coffee went cold on the kitchen counter. Her black dress hung over the back of the chair, not yet put away, not yet dry cleaned, still holding the shape of her body from 3 days ago when she had stood beside a grave and watched them lower Frank into the November ground. The photograph in the newspaper showed her own front door. She recognized the crack in the concrete step where Frank had dropped a hammer in 1987. She recognized the brown paint on the storm door that they had chosen together at the hardware store on Main Street, arguing for 40 minutes about whether it was too dark. She recognized the rose bush her sister had planted when Gary was born, now cut down to stumps in the photograph, already erased from the listing as if it had never existed. The listing said, sold, pending final inspection. It said, closed escrow November 14, the same date as Frank's funeral. Dorothy read the words 3 times. Her fingers did not tremble. She had been a high school art teacher for 34 years, and she had learned that trembling was a choice, that the hand could be trained to stay still even when the rest of the body wanted to fall apart. She set the newspaper down flat on the table. She smoothed the crease with her palm. She picked up her cold coffee and drank it, because it was there and because she did not know what else to do with her hands. She looked at the listing agent's name at the bottom of the column. She did not call. She did not scream. She walked to the coat closet in the hallway and opened the door and stood there for a long moment, looking at the inside of the closet as if she had never seen it before. Frank's brown work jacket hung on the left hook. She had not moved it. She could still smell him on the collar, sawdust, motor oil, the faint soreness of honest sweat. She touched the sleeve. The fabric was cold. The doorbell rang. She did not answer it. The doorbell rang again. She stayed in the closet with her hand on Frank's jacket until the ringing stopped, and then she walked back to the kitchen and folded the newspaper into a square and placed it in the drawer beneath the phone book where she kept the takeout menus and the coupons that expired 2 years ago. She closed the drawer. She washed her coffee cup in the sink. She dried it with the blue dish towel that Frank had bought at a garage sale in 1996 and hung it on the hook above the faucet. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and waited for her son to arrive, because she knew he would. He had always come to finish what he started. Dorothy met Frank on a Tuesday in September of 1970. She was 22 years old, fresh out of state college with a teaching degree she had paid for by working summers at a canning factory, and she had gone to the county fair alone because her roommate had canceled at the last minute. The Ferris wheel lights were reflected in puddles from the afternoon rain. She was standing at the ring toss booth, holding 3 wooden rings that she had already paid for but had not yet thrown, when a man beside her said, "You're holding them wrong." She turned. Frank was 25. He had sawdust in his hair and calluses on his hands that she could see even in the dim fairground light. He was wearing a flannel shirt with a tear at the elbow that had been mended badly by a man with thread that did not match. He smiled at her like he had known her for years. "You hold them flat," he said, "like a frisbee. Not like a horseshoe. Here." He took one of the rings from her hand. His fingers brushed hers and he paused, just for a fraction of a second, and then he threw the ring underhand in a flat arc that landed perfectly over the neck of a glass bottle. The ring settled. Carney groaned. Frank looked at her. "See?" She did not see. She saw him. She saw the way the light caught the gray in his eyes, the way he stood with his weight on his left leg because his right knee had been bad since he was 17 and a ladder had slipped on a job site. She saw the sketchbook tucked into his back pocket, a cheap spiral-bound thing with a bent cover and pages that were soft from handling. "You draw," she said. It was not a question. Frank looked down at his own pocket as if surprised to find the sketchbook there. He pulled it out. The cover was covered in pencil smudges and coffee stains, and the name Frank, written in black marker, faded almost to nothing. He opened it to a random page and showed her a portrait of an old man sitting on a bench, drawn in charcoal, the lines so precise and so gentle that Dorothy felt her breath catch in her throat. "I'm not very good," he said. "You're wrong," she said. He closed the sketchbook. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he handed her the ring he had won. "Keep it," he said. "I've got no use for a bottle." She kept it for 53 years. She kept the ring in a small wooden box on her nightstand, next to a photograph of the two of them at the fair that night, taken by a stranger with a Polaroid camera. In the photograph, Frank is looking at her, not at the lens. She is laughing at something he has just said, her head tilted back, her hand touching his arm. The ring is in her other hand, visible at the edge of the frame, a cheap carnival prize that she would later learn was worth approximately 14 cents wholesale. She never threw it away. She never even thought about throwing it away. Because the ring was not the point. The ring was never the point. The point was the moment, and the man, and the way he had looked at her like she was the only person in the world who mattered, and the sketchbook he had shown her, and the portrait he would draw of her that night, sitting on a bench near the Ferris wheel while the fairground lights flickered and the music from the carousel floated across the damp September air. He drew her in pencil. He drew her exactly as she was, 22 years old, wearing a yellow sundress that she had bought at a thrift store for $3, her hair pulled back with a rubber band, a smudge of fairground dust on her cheek. He drew the curve of her jaw. He drew the slight crookedness of her smile. He drew the way her hands rested in her lap, one holding the ring, the other open and waiting. He signed it at the bottom, F. Morrow, 1971. He gave it to her on their one-year anniversary, framed in a simple black frame that he had built himself from scrap wood. She hung it in the hallway of every home they ever shared. They married in June of 1972 at the county courthouse, because neither of them had money for a wedding and neither of them wanted to wait. Dorothy wore the yellow sundress because it was the nicest thing she owned. Frank wore a suit jacket he had borrowed from his brother, and Dorothy could see the stitches where she had taken in the sleeves the night before, working by lamplight because the power had been shut off for 3 hours that afternoon. The judge was a heavy woman with gray hair and kind eyes who had married them without asking why they had come alone. Frank's hands shook when he put the ring on Dorothy's finger. He had saved for 6 months to buy it, a thin gold band with a small diamond that was not quite clear, that had a fleck of carbon visible at the center if you looked closely enough. He had bought it from a pawn shop on 3rd Street, and he had paid $40, and he had hidden it in the toe of a boot in the back of his closet for 3 months, because he was terrified she would find it before the wedding. She had found it, of course. She had not said anything. She had put it back in the boot and closed the closet door and pretended she had never seen it, because she knew that he needed to give it to her himself, that the act of giving was as important to him as the thing itself. When he slipped it onto her finger, she saw relief flood his face, and she understood that he had been afraid she would not like it, that the flaw in the diamond would bother her, that she would think he should have waited until he could afford something better. She kissed him. She did not let him see the ring on her hand for the rest of the day because she was afraid she would cry, and she did not want to cry because she was happy and because she had never been so sure of anything in her life. The house on Maple Street was not their first home. Their first home was a one-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner's on the south side of town, where the smell of chemicals seeped through the floorboards and the radiator knocked all winter and the toilet ran constantly because the landlord refused to fix it. They lived there for 4 years. Frank worked 60-hour weeks as an electrician apprentice, coming home with burns on his forearms and grease under his nails. Dorothy taught art at the high school, grading papers at the kitchen table while Frank slept on the couch, because the bedroom was too hot in summer and too cold in winter and the bed sagged in the middle. They saved every penny. They ate canned soup and day-old bread from the bakery outlet. They did not go to movies. They did not buy new clothes. They drove a 1969 Chevrolet Impala that Frank had bought for $200 and kept running with duct tape and prayers and the kind of mechanical ingenuity that came from growing up poor and learning to fix everything yourself because you could not afford to pay someone else. Gary was born in 1975. Dorothy remembered the delivery room, the fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, the way Frank had held her hand so tightly that she thought her fingers would break. She remembered the doctor placing Gary on her chest, the weight of him, the heat of him, the way he had opened his eyes and looked at her with the unfocused gaze of a newborn who could not yet see but was already searching. Frank had cried. He had tried to hide it, turning his face away, but she had seen the tears on his cheeks, and she had reached up and touched his jaw and said, "It's okay. You're allowed." He had not argued. He had sat down in the chair beside her bed and held her hand and looked at his son and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have been enough. The house on Maple Street came 7 years later. It was a three-bedroom colonial built in 1952 with a cracked driveway and a roof that needed replacing and a basement that flooded every spring. The siding was faded blue, the kind of blue that looked gray in certain light, and the front porch sagged on the left side where the foundation had settled unevenly. The real estate agent had apologized for the condition of the property. She had suggested they look at something newer, something in better shape, something that would not require so much work. Frank had walked through the front door and stopped in the middle of the living room and looked up at the ceiling. "This is it," he said. Dorothy had looked at him. "The ceiling has a hole in it." "I can fix the ceiling." "The floors are warped." "I can fix the floors." "The kitchen is from 1960. "I can fix the kitchen." She had looked at him, and she had seen something in his face that she had not seen in years. Hope. The kind of hope that comes from standing in a room that is falling apart and seeing not the rot, but the possibility. The kind of hope that had been worn thin by years of apartment living, by landlords who did not care, by the constant awareness that the walls around them belonged to someone else. She had taken his hand. "Okay," she said, "let's fix it." They fixed everything. Frank rewired the entire house in his spare time, running new circuits through the walls, replacing the knob and tube wiring that had been installed in 1952 and had never been updated. He replaced the roof in a single weekend, working from dawn until dark, and Dorothy climbed up to hand him shingles because he would not let her do more than that, and she would not let him do it alone. He rebuilt the front porch, jacking up the sagging corner and pouring a new foundation, and he built a railing with turned balusters that he had carved himself on a lathe he bought at a garage sale for $20. Dorothy painted every room. She chose the colors carefully: warm cream for the living room, soft blue for the bedroom, pale yellow for the kitchen. She painted the trim white, 3 coats, sanding between each one until the wood was smooth as glass. She stenciled a border of ivy along the top of the dining room wall, a pattern she had designed herself, and she worked on it for 2 weeks, standing on a ladder for hours at a time, her back itching, her hands stained with paint. She planted the garden. Roses along the front fence, peonies on the side of the house, a vegetable patch in the back where the sun hit the ground for most of the afternoon. She planted a maple tree in the front yard, a sapling that came in a plastic pot from the nursery, and she watered it every morning for 3 years until it was tall enough to survive on its own. The house became theirs. Not on paper. On paper, the house belonged to the bank, and they made payments for 30 years, never missing one, never late, writing checks from the joint account that held everything they earned and everything they saved. But in the way that mattered, the house belonged to them in the way that a body belongs to the soul that lives in it, not as property, but as presence. The deed clause for Frank's idea. It was 1988. They had been in the house for 7 years. They had paid off the roof and the wiring and the new furnace. They had painted every room twice. They had planted the garden and built the porch and installed the kitchen cabinets that Frank had built himself from oak that he had milled from a fallen tree on his brother's property. Dorothy came home from school one afternoon and found Frank sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of legal documents spread out before him. He had his reading glasses on, the ones he hated wearing, the ones that made him look like an old man even though he was only 43. "What's all this?" she asked. Frank looked up. He had that expression on his face, the one he got when he was about to do something that he knew she might not agree with but that he believed in anyway. "I'm adding something to the deed," he said. Dorothy set her bag down. "What kind of something?" "A clause," he said, "a transfer restriction. So the house can't be sold without both of us agreeing, even if one of us is gone." She sat down across from him. The kitchen light flickered. The old fixture still had a loose connection that Frank had never quite fixed, and the shadows moved across his face like water. "Frank," she said slowly, "we're not going anywhere." "I know." "Then why?" He took off his glasses. He rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands, the way he always did when he was tired, and then he looked at her with the same gray eyes that had looked at her across a ring-toss booth 18 years earlier. "Because Gary is going to want this house someday," he said, "and I don't want him to be able to take it from you." Dorothy stared at him. "He's 12 years old," she said. "I know. You're planning for something that might never happen." "I know. And you think," she stopped. She did not want to say the words out loud. She did not want to give them substance by speaking them into the air between them. You think he would do that? To me? Frank was silent for a long moment. He looked down at the documents on the table, at his own handwriting in the margins, at the careful notes he had made in pencil. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. I think he has your stubbornness, he said, and I think he has my practicality, and I think that combination, without wisdom, without patience, he shook his head, I think it could make him dangerous. To himself, to the people who love him. Dorothy looked at her son, who was playing in the backyard, visible through the kitchen window. Gary was throwing a baseball against the side of the garage, catching it on the rebound, throwing it again. He was 12. He had a paper route. He had a collection of comic books that he kept in alphabetical order. He still kissed her goodnight every evening, his face scrunched up in embarrassment, his lips barely brushing her cheek. You're wrong, she said. Frank looked at her. I hope I am. Sign your clause, she said. I'll sign it too. But you're wrong. Frank signed the document. Dorothy signed it beside him, her signature looping and confident, the same signature she had used for 30 years of lesson plans and report cards and letters to her mother. The notary came the next day, a woman from down the street who asked no questions and stamped the papers with a flourish and left without coffee. The clause was recorded at the county clerk's office. It sat in the deed, invisible, unremarkable, a few lines of legal language that no one would notice unless they were looking for it. Frank never mentioned it again. Dorothy forgot about it. Nah. Gary did not turn out dangerous. He turned out ordinary, which was somehow worse. He was a good student, but not great. He played baseball, but not well enough to make varsity. He went to college, but dropped out after 2 years because he said it was a waste of money. He worked a series of jobs: retail, construction, a brief stint selling insurance, and he quit each one with a different excuse that always sounded reasonable, but never quite held up under scrutiny. He married a woman named Brenda in 2001. The wedding was small, held at a park pavilion, and Dorothy made the cake herself because Gary had asked her to, and because she wanted to feel useful. Brenda was a real estate agent. She had sharp eyes and a sharper smile, and she spoke about houses the way other people spoke about investments, which was to say that she spoke about them as numbers rather than homes. Dorothy did not dislike Brenda. She simply did not understand her. She did not understand how anyone could walk through a house and see only square footage and resale value and potential profit. She did not understand how anyone could look at a home, at the walls that held a family's history, at the floors that had been worn smooth by years of footsteps, at the windows that framed the same view for decades, and see only a transaction waiting to happen. But she tried. She invited Brenda for Sunday dinners. She knitted her a scarf for Christmas. She listened to her talk about the market and the interest rates and the comps in the neighborhood, nodding along, pretending to understand, because Gary had chosen her and Dorothy had learned long ago that you cannot choose for your children. Gary and Brenda had a daughter in 2003. Emma was born with Frank's gray eyes and Dorothy's stubborn chin, and she was the only thing that made Gary seem real to Dorothy anymore. When he held his daughter, something softened in his face. Something became visible that was usually hidden, a tenderness that he had learned to cover with cynicism and impatience and the kind of brittle confidence that comes from never having been truly tested. Dorothy watched him with Emma and she thought, maybe he will be different with her. She did not say it out loud. She did not want to jinx it. Frank got sick in 2022. It started with a cough that would not go away, then the fatigue, the weight loss, the nights spent sitting up in bed because he could not breathe lying down. Dorothy took him to the doctor. The doctor ordered tests. The tests came back with words that Dorothy had to write down because she could not hold them in her head. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Scarring of the lungs, no known cause, no cure. Frank took the news the way he took everything, with a nod and a question about what came next. What comes next, the doctor said, is oxygen and medication, and eventually he stopped. He did not want to say the word. Eventually, Frank said, I die. The doctor did not correct him. Dorothy drove home with Frank beside her in the passenger seat, the oxygen tank strapped into the back, the tubing snaking forward to the cannula in his nose. He looked out the window at the streets he had driven for 50 years. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything they did not yet know how to say. At home, Frank sat down in his recliner and looked around the living room as if seeing it for the first time. I want to add you to the deed, he said. Dorothy stopped in the middle of hanging up his coat. What? The deed. I want to make sure it transfers to you automatically, so there's no probate. So there's no, he gestured vaguely, complications. She walked over to him. She knelt beside his chair and took his hand. His skin was warm, thinner than it used to be, the veins visible beneath the surface. We've been married for 50 years, she said. Everything we own is already joint. I know. Then why? He looked at her. His eyes were the same gray they had always been, but there was something new in them, something that looked like fear and looked like love and looked like both at once. Because I need to know you'll be okay, he said, after. She pressed her forehead to his. She closed her eyes. She felt his breath on her face, shallow and labored, the air moving through lungs that were slowly turning to stone. I'll be okay, she said. Promise me. I promise. He signed the paperwork the next week. He signed a power of attorney too, because the lawyer said it would be useful if Frank became unable to make decisions for himself. Frank signed it without reading it carefully, because his hands were shaking and his vision was blurring and he was tired, so tired of fighting for breath. Dorothy watched him sign. She did not read the document either. She trusted the lawyer, who had been their neighbor for 20 years. She trusted the system, which had never given her reason to doubt. She trusted that the documents were what they were supposed to be, because why would they not be? The Tuesday in November started like any other Tuesday. Dorothy woke at 6, the way she had woken for 53 years, because her body had learned the rhythm of Frank's schedule, even though he no longer had a schedule to keep. She made coffee. She sat in the living room with the cup in her hands and looked at the empty recliner and felt the absence of him like a physical weight in her chest. The funeral had been 4 days ago. She had worn black, because that was what you wore. She had stood beside the grave and listened to the minister speak words that she did not hear, because her ears were full of the sound of Frank's breathing, the last breath he had taken in the hospital bed, the way his hand had gone slack in hers. She had watched them lower the casket into the ground. She had dropped a handful of dirt onto the wood, and the sound it made had been smaller than she expected, softer, like rain on a roof. She had come home alone. The house was silent. The house had always been silent when Frank was not in it, but now the silence was different. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of emptiness. The walls did not creak. The furnace did not rumble. The refrigerator did not hum. Everything had stopped, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that had not yet happened. She picked up the Sunday paper from the driveway. It was Tuesday. The paper was 3 days old. She had not had the energy to retrieve it earlier, had not cared about the news, had not wanted to see the date on the front page, because the date would remind her that the world was still moving forward while she was standing still. She brought the paper inside. She set it on the kitchen table. She poured her coffee and sat down and opened the real estate section, because Frank had always read the real estate section, because he had liked to look at the photographs of houses and imagine the lives that were lived inside them. She saw her own front door. She saw the crack in the concrete step. She saw the brown paint on the storm door. She saw the rose bush that was no longer there, cut down to stumps, erased from the photograph as if it had never existed. She read the listing. Sold. Pending final inspection, closed escrow November 14. The same date as Frank's funeral. She read the listing agent's name. Brenda Morrow. Her daughter-in-law. She read the seller's name. Gary Morrow by power of attorney. Her son. She set the paper down. She picked up her coffee. She drank it because it was there and because she did not know what else to do with her hands. The coffee was cold. It had been cold for a while. She had not noticed. She walked to the coat closet. She opened the door. She touched Frank's jacket. The fabric was cold. She stood there for a long time, her hand on the sleeve, her forehead pressed against the collar, breathing in the smell of him that was fading, that was leaving, that was going away like everything else. The doorbell rang. She did not answer it. The doorbell rang again. She stayed in the closet. Gary came anyway. He had a key. He had always had a key. Frank had given him a key when he turned 16, and Gary had never given it back, and Dorothy had never asked for it because she had never had a reason to. She heard the front door open. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, the same footsteps she had heard for 49 years, the same rhythm, the same weight. She stepped out of the closet and closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway facing him. Gary stopped when he saw her. He was wearing a suit, a good suit, navy blue with a tie that matched. He looked like he was going to a business meeting. He looked like he was going to a closing. "Mom," he said. She did not answer. He shifted his weight. He looked at the floor. He looked at the wall. He looked everywhere except at her face. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I was going to come by yesterday, but I thought maybe you needed time after the funeral." She still did not answer. "The house," he said. "I sold it. We sold it. Brenda had a buyer lined up and the offer was good and the timing." He stopped. He took a breath. The timing worked out. Dorothy looked at her son. She looked at the shape of his face, which was Frank's face, which was the face of the man who had held her hand in a delivery room and cried when his son was born. She looked at his hands, which were Frank's hands, which had learned to fix things, which had learned to build things, which had learned to hold her. "What debt?" she said. Gary blinked. "What?" "You said Dad would have wanted the debt cleared in the listing. Your comment. What debt?" Gary looked away. There were medical bills, and the funeral, and... "We have insurance," Dorothy said. "We've had insurance for 40 years. Frank paid for it every month. There is no debt." Gary said nothing. "There is no debt," Dorothy repeated. "You sold my house for nothing." "It's not nothing. The market is good right now. We got 218,000. That's what?" He met her eyes. Something flickered in his face, something that looked like anger and looked like shame and looked like neither, because it was too complicated to be either. "That's enough to pay off our credit cards," he said, "and the car loan, and the HELOC on our house." And he stopped. "We were drowning, Mom, Brenda and me. We were drowning. And you had this house, this asset just sitting here, and Dad was gone. And I thought... You thought you would take it. I thought you wouldn't need it anymore." Dorothy heard the words. She heard them the way she had heard the minister's words at the funeral, from a distance, as if they were being spoken to someone else, in a language she understood but could not feel. "I need it," she said. "I need this house. It's where I live. It's where I raised you. It's where your father died. It's where..." Her voice broke. She stopped. She pressed her lips together and waited for the break to pass. "It's where I am." Gary's face hardened. "You can't afford it," he said. "The taxes alone are..." "I can afford it." "You're on a fixed income. You have Social Security and a tiny pension. You can't..." "I can afford it," she said again. "I have savings. I have..." "The savings are gone, Mom." She stared at him. "The medical bills," he said. "The last few months, Dad's oxygen, the hospital stays, that..." "We had insurance," she said again. "We had Medicare. We had..." "You had a deductible, and copays, and things that insurance didn't cover." He was speaking faster now, the words coming out in a rush, as if he had rehearsed them. "I paid them. I used the power of attorney. I accessed the accounts. I paid the bills." Dorothy felt the floor shift beneath her. "Which accounts?" "All of them. The savings, the checking, the CD that matured in October. I used it all." "You used..." She stopped. She could not form the words. "You emptied our accounts?" "I paid the bills," he said. "I paid the funeral. I paid everything that needed to be paid. And then I sold the house because there was nothing left, and because we needed..." "You needed..." "Yes." She looked at her son. She looked at the suit he was wearing, which was new, which was expensive, which had been purchased recently, which had tags that she could see on the inside of the collar, not yet removed. "How much did you need?" she asked. Gary did not answer. "How much did you take?" He still did not answer. "Gary." "Enough," he said. "Enough to fix things, enough to make it right." Dorothy looked at the walls around her, the walls she had painted, the walls Frank had wired. The walls that held the heat of 53 years of meals and arguments and laughter and tears, and the quiet, steady rhythm of two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other every day for half a century. "When do I have to leave?" she asked. Gary looked at the floor. "The new owners take possession in 30 days. 30 days. 30 days from the closing," which was, he stopped, which was Friday. Dorothy nodded. She walked past him, into the kitchen. She opened the drawer beneath the phone book and took out the folded newspaper and set it on the counter. She opened it to the real estate section. She looked at the photograph of her house, her home, the place where she had lived for 40 years, and she saw that in the photograph, the curtains she had sewn by hand were visible in the window. She had not taken them down yet. She had not taken anything down. She had not known she needed to. "I want you to leave," she said. "Mom." "Leave." "Let me explain." "Leave," she said, "now." Gary stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. She could feel him looking at her back, could feel the weight of his gaze on her shoulders. She did not turn around. He left. The front door closed. The lock clicked. His car started in the driveway, a new car, a black SUV with tinted windows, and she heard it pull away, and the sound of it faded into the distance, and then there was silence. She stood at the kitchen counter with the newspaper in her hands and looked at the photograph of her house and thought about the curtains she had sewn. She had made them in 1985. She had bought the fabric at a discount store, a floral pattern that Frank had said looked like something his grandmother would have liked, which she knew was his way of saying he liked it too. She had spent 3 weeks sewing them, working on the machine her mother had given her, the same machine that had been her mother's before that. She had hung them in the living room window, and they had stayed there for 38 years, through sun and rain and snow and wind, through children growing up and pets dying and holidays and ordinary days and the slow, quiet accumulation of a lifetime. She took them down. She folded them carefully and placed them in a box. She did not know where she would put the box. She did not know where she would put anything. She did not know where she would be in 30 days, or what she would do, or how she would survive. She only knew that she would not cry in front of her son, and she would not break in front of her son, and she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her fall apart. She had learned in 34 years of teaching high school art that the hand could be trained to stay still. She had not yet learned that the heart could be trained the same way. The first night was the hardest. Dorothy sat in the living room after dark in Frank's recliner because her own chair felt wrong and because it still smelled like him, faintly, under the antiseptic smell of the hospital. She did not turn on the lights. She did not eat. She did not drink anything. She sat in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the creaks and groans of wood cooling, the whisper of wind through the cracks in the window frames, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. She thought about Frank. She thought about the way he had looked at her when he signed the power of attorney, tired and trusting, believing that the documents would protect her. She thought about the way he had said, "I need to know you'll be okay," and she thought about how she had promised him she would be, and she thought about how that promise was already broken, already impossible, already ash in her mouth. She thought about Gary. She thought about the baby he had been, the way he had curled his fingers around hers in the hospital, the way he had looked at her with those unfocused newborn eyes. She thought about the boy he had become, the one who threw baseballs against the garage and kissed her goodnight with his face scrunched up in embarrassment. She thought about the man he was now, the one who had sold her house while she was burying her husband. She did not know where the boy had gone. She did not know when he had become this stranger who wore expensive suits and drove expensive cars and spoke about debts that did not exist. She sat in the dark until the clock on the mantel struck 3 in the morning, and then she got up and walked to the hallway and stood in front of Frank's sketchbook. It was still on the shelf where he had kept it for 53 years, between a collection of poetry she had never read and a book about birds that he had bought at a library sale and never opened. The sketchbook was worn, the cover soft from decades of handling, the spiral binding bent and frayed. She took it down. She held it in her hands. She felt the weight of it, which was the weight of his life, of the things he had drawn and the things he had seen and the things he had tried to capture before they disappeared. She opened it. The first page was blank. The second page was a drawing of a tree done in pencil, the lines loose and confident, the branches reaching outward in a way that suggested movement even in stillness. The third page was a portrait of a woman she did not recognize, someone from his past. Before her, a face that had mattered to him once and had been forgotten. She turned the pages slowly. She found the portrait he had drawn of her in 1971, the one that had hung in the hallway of every home they had ever shared. She had taken it down when she took the curtains down, and she had not known where to put it, and she had placed it here, between the pages of the sketchbook, because she could not bear to leave it on the wall in a house that was no longer hers. She looked at her own face drawn by Frank's hand 53 years ago. She looked at the yellow sundress she had been wearing, the one she had bought at a thrift store for $3, the one she had worn to their wedding. She looked at the slight crookedness of her smile, the way her hands rested in her lap, the ring she was holding in one hand, the ring he had won for her at the county fair. She touched the paper. She felt the texture of the pencil lines, the slight indentation where Frank had pressed harder, the softness of the shading, the precision of the details. She could see him drawing this, sitting on the bench beside her, looking at her with those gray eyes that saw everything and forgave everything. She closed the sketch book and pressed it against her chest. The spiral binding dug into her ribs, and she held it there for a long time, breathing in the smell of old paper and graphite, and something that might have been Frank's aftershave, though she knew that was impossible, that it had been years, that the scent was only memory playing tricks on her. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the armchair by the window, the sketchbook on her lap, and watched the street grow light. The garbage trucks came and went. A dog barked somewhere. The neighbor across the way opened his curtains and stood for a moment in his kitchen drinking coffee, unaware that she was watching him, unaware that the world was still turning even though Frank was dead and her son was a stranger and the house was sold out from under her. She waited until 9 in the morning. Then she called the number that Sarah had given her, the one for the lawyer who handled estate disputes and fraud cases, and the kind of trouble that she had never imagined she would be part of. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered, her voice crisp and professional, and Eleanor told her everything. The house, the power of attorney, the document she had signed in the hospital, the way Gary had shown up at the funeral with a realtor and a contract and a price that was less than half of what the house was worth. The lawyer listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, there was a pause, and then the lawyer said, "Mrs. Vance, do you still have the original power of attorney document?" "I don't know," Eleanor said. "I don't know what he did with it." "We'll need to find it, or prove it exists. Do you have any witnesses to the signing?" Eleanor thought about the hospital room, the thin light, the way Gary had held the pen in front of her face, the way she had been barely conscious, the way the nurse had come in and out and said nothing, the way the whole world had been reduced to the small circle of her pain. "No," she said, "no witnesses." The lawyer was quiet for a moment. "That's going to make this difficult." Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought about the house. She thought about Frank's toolshed, the way he had organized the screwdrivers by size, the way he had painted the porch swing every spring, the way the front door had a slight warp that meant you had to lift it just a little when you turned the key. She thought about Gary's bedroom, still painted the pale blue he had chosen when he was 12, the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to the ceiling, the baseball trophy still on the shelf. "I don't care about the money," she said. "I care about the house." "I understand," the lawyer said, "but your son sold it to a developer. They've already filed the permits. They're planning to demolish it." Eleanor felt something break inside her chest. It was not a dramatic thing, not a sharp pain or a sudden collapse. It was more like a thread snapping, something that had been holding her together for 63 years, something that had been fraying since the day Frank died, something that had finally given way. "When?" she said. "Next week, Tuesday." She had 5 days. She spent the first day walking through the house room by room, touching everything. She ran her fingers along the kitchen counter, the same counter where she had rolled out pie dough for 50 years, the same counter where Gary had done his homework while she cooked dinner, the same counter where Frank had leaned while he told her about his day, his voice low and steady, the same counter where she had stood when the phone rang and a stranger told her that her husband had been taken to the hospital. She took the portrait of herself from the sketchbook and laid it flat on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a long time, at the yellow sundress, at the crooked smile, at the ring in her hand. She remembered the county fair. She remembered the way Frank had won the ring for her, how he had thrown baseballs at stacked bottles until the man running the booth finally gave in and handed it over. She remembered the way he had slid it onto her finger, the way the cheap metal had felt warm from his hand, the way she had known, even then, that this was the man she would love for the rest of her life. She put the portrait in her bag. She did the same with the collection of poetry, the one that had sat beside the sketchbook on the shelf. She had never read it, but Frank had. He had marked pages with a pencil, folded down the corners, written notes in the margins in his small, precise handwriting. She took that too. She took the book about birds, even though it had never been opened, because Frank had bought it at a library sale, and he had kept it for 40 years, and that meant something. even if she could not say exactly what. She took the baseball trophy from Gary's room. She took the glow-in-the-dark stars. She took the measuring cup she had used every morning for the oatmeal that Frank had eaten for breakfast, the one with the faded red handle, the one that had been her mother's before it was hers. She filled 3 boxes and a suitcase. On the second day, Sarah came to help her pack the rest. They worked in silence for most of the morning, folding clothes and wrapping dishes and taping boxes shut. Around noon, Sarah stopped and looked at Eleanor with an expression that was both careful and determined. "I found something," she said, "at the county clerk's office." Eleanor looked up from the box she was sealing. "What?" "The power of attorney. Gary filed it, but there's a problem with the date." Sarah pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to Eleanor. It was a copy of the document, the one Eleanor had signed, or that Gary had told her she had signed. The date at the top was 2 weeks before Frank's death. But at the bottom, next to Eleanor's signature, there was a second date, written in Gary's handwriting, the day of the funeral. "He backdated it," Sarah said. "He knew you were too sick to remember. He knew no one would check." Eleanor looked at the date, the neat, careful numbers that her son had written, and she felt something shift inside her. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was something colder, something that had been waiting for this moment, something that knew what to do. "Can we prove it?" she said. "The nurse who was on shift that day remembered you. She remembered Gary. She said you were barely conscious when he came in. She said he told her he was just visiting, that he didn't need anything, that he would handle everything himself. She remembered because she thought it was strange that he didn't ask for help." Eleanor closed her eyes. She saw the hospital room again, the thin light, the shape of her son standing over her. She saw the pen in his hand. She saw the way he had not met her eyes, the way he had signed her name without asking, the way he had folded the paper and put it in his pocket and walked out. "She's willing to testify," Sarah said. On the third day, the lawyer called. The developer had agreed to a meeting. They had heard about the potential legal challenge, the forged document, the nurse who was willing to speak. They were nervous. They did not want bad publicity. They were willing to negotiate. Eleanor went to the meeting in the same dress she had worn to Frank's funeral. It was the only nice dress she owned, a dark blue with a small white collar, the kind of dress that had been appropriate for church and funerals and meetings with lawyers. She sat across from the developer, a man in his 40s with an expensive suit and a tired expression, and she looked at him the way she had looked at Gary in the hospital room. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She told him about the house. She told him about Frank, about the garden, about the porch swing, about the way the front door stuck when the weather was humid. She told him about the 63 years she had lived in that house, the meals she had cooked, the birthdays she had celebrated, the death she had endured. The developer listened. He looked at his watch. He looked at his lawyer. He looked at Eleanor again. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I paid for that house. I have permits. I have a timeline." "I understand," Eleanor said, "but you paid my son, not me, and my son had no right to sell it." The developer's lawyer leaned in and whispered something. The developer's face changed. He looked at Eleanor with something that might have been pity, or might have been calculation, or might have been both. "What do you want?" he said. "I want the house back," Eleanor said. "I want the sale voided. I want to go home." The developer shook his head. "I can't do that. I've already committed capital. I have crews scheduled. I have investors." "Then let me buy it back," Eleanor said, "for what you paid." The developer laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, but it was not kind either. "You don't have that kind of money." "I don't," Eleanor agreed. "But the court might force you to sell it back to me at a fair price once the fraud is proven, and by the time that happens, you'll have spent more on legal fees than you would have made on the deal. You'll have lost your timeline. You'll have lost your permits. You'll have lost more than you'll ever get from tearing down a house that doesn't belong to you." She said it calmly, the way Frank used to say things when he was arguing with the insurance company or the bank or the man who tried to overcharge them for a new roof. She said it the way she had learned to say things in 63 years of being married to a man who never raised his voice, but always got what he needed. The developer stared at her. His lawyer whispered again. The developer looked at his watch. "I'll have my people call your lawyer," he said. That night, Eleanor sat in the armchair by the window of Sarah's guest room, the sketchbook on her lap, and she did not feel victorious. She did not feel relieved. She felt something else, something that was not quite peace and not quite hope, something that was just the quiet knowledge that she had done what she could. On the fourth day, the lawyer called again. The developer had agreed to void the sale. He would return the house to Eleanor. In exchange, she would drop any legal claims against him and agree not to pursue damages. The house was hers again. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the bed. She held the phone in her hand. She listened to the lawyer's voice, professional and measured, explaining the details, the timeline, the paperwork. She heard the words, but she did not fully absorb them. She was thinking about the house. She was thinking about the way the morning light came through the kitchen window. She was thinking about the garden, the peonies she had planted when Gary was born, the rose bush that Frank had given her for their 25th anniversary. "Mrs. Vance?" the lawyer said. "Are you still there?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I'm here." "You'll need to come sign the papers. We can do it tomorrow." "I'll be there," she said. She hung up. She sat in the quiet of Sarah's guest room, the sound of the ceiling fan above her, the distant hum of traffic, the soft ticking of the clock on the nightstand. She thought about calling Gary. She thought about telling him what had happened, about the house, about the lawyer, about the nurse who had remembered. She thought about asking him why. But she did not call. She did not have anything to say to him. On the fifth day, Tuesday, the day the house was supposed to have been demolished, Eleanor went back. Sarah drove her. They pulled up in front of the house and Eleanor got out and stood on the sidewalk looking at it. It was still standing. The front door was still warped. The porch swing was still there, swaying slightly in the breeze. The garden was overgrown, the peonies gone to seed, the rose bush wild and untrimmed, but it was still there. She walked up the steps. She took the key from her purse, the same key she had used for 50 years, and she unlocked the door. It stuck when she pushed it, the way it always did, and she lifted it slightly the way she always did, and it opened. The house was empty. The developer had taken everything that was not nailed down, cleared out the furniture, the appliances, the curtains. The floors were bare. The walls were bare. The kitchen was a shell, the cabinets gone, the countertop stripped, the sink nothing but a hole in the wall. But it was still her house. She walked through it room by room. She touched the walls. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the empty space where the table had been, where she had rolled pie dough and watched Gary do his homework and listened to Frank talk about his day. She stood in the bedroom where Frank had died. The bed was gone, the nightstand gone, the lamp gone, but the window was still there, the one she had opened every morning to let in the air, the one she had closed every night to keep out the dark. She stood there for a long time. Sarah found her in the hallway, standing in front of the empty shelf where the sketchbook had been. Eleanor was holding the portrait of herself, the one in the yellow sundress, the one Frank had drawn in 1971. "Are you okay?" Sarah said. Eleanor looked at her own face, drawn by Frank's hand, 53 years ago. She looked at the yellow sundress. She looked at the ring in her hand. She looked at the slight crookedness of her smile. "I think so," she said. She folded the portrait carefully and put it back in her bag. They left the house and drove back to Sarah's. Eleanor did not look back. She did not need to. She knew the house would still be there. She knew she would go back. She knew she would rebuild slowly, piece by piece, the way she had rebuilt everything else in her life. The next week, the letter came. It was in a plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked from a city 3 states away. Sarah brought it to her in the guest room, and Eleanor opened it with the careful, deliberate motions of someone who had learned not to hurry. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was Gary's. She recognized it immediately, the way the letters slanted, the way he pressed hard on the downstrokes, the way he had never learned to form a proper capital G. It said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I know nothing will ever be enough. I was drowning. I made bad choices. I thought if I could just fix everything, if I could just get enough money, I could make it right. I thought I could fix it before you found out. I thought I could fix it before Dad died. I was wrong. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to understand. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I know what I did. I know it was wrong. I know I hurt you. I know I hurt Dad. I'm sorry. I won't bother you again. Gary." Eleanor read the letter 3 times. She did not cry. She did not crumple it up. She did not call the number that was not there, the number he had not included, the number that would have connected her to a voice she had not heard in months. She folded the letter carefully, the way she had folded the portrait of herself, and she placed it in the sketchbook, between the pages where Frank had drawn the tree. She closed the sketchbook. She put it on the nightstand. That night she dreamt of the garden. She was kneeling in the dirt, her hands in the soil, the sun warm on her back. Frank was beside her, digging a hole for a new rose bush, his hands steady and sure. He looked at her and smiled, the way he had smiled at the county fair, the way he had smiled at their wedding, the way he had smiled at her every day for 63 years. "It's going to be beautiful," he said. She woke up with dirt under her nails. She did not know how it had gotten there. She had not been in the garden. She had not been outside. But it was there, dark and real, caught in the creases of her fingers, and she looked at it for a long time, and then she got up and washed her hands. She went back to the house the next day. She started with the garden. She pulled the weeds. She trimmed the rose bush. She watered the peonies, even though they were past their season, even though they were brown and dry and looked like nothing more than dead sticks in the ground. She worked until her back ached and her hands were raw and the sun had started to go down. She stood up and looked at what she had done. The garden was not beautiful. It was not restored. It was just a patch of dirt with a few tired plants and a lot of work still to do. But it was hers. It was Frank's. It was the same dirt he had turned every spring, the same dirt he had planted in, the same dirt that had grown the peonies he had given her when Gary was born. She sat down on the porch swing. She looked at the house. She looked at the warped front door. She looked at the chipped paint on the window frames. She looked at the roof that needed new shingles and the gutters that needed cleaning and the porch that needed a fresh coat of stain. She looked at her hands. They were old. They were wrinkled. They were stained with dirt. They were the same hands that had held Frank's hand when he died. They were the same hands that had signed the paper that gave away her house. They were the same hands that had opened the sketchbook and found the portrait of herself in a yellow sundress. She did not know what came next. She did not know if she could afford to fix the roof. She did not know if she had the strength to paint the porch. She did not know if she would ever be able to sit in the kitchen again without feeling the weight of everything that had been lost. She did not know where Gary was. She did not know if he was okay. She did not know if she wanted to know. She sat on the porch swing and watched the sun go down, and she thought about the letter. She thought about the words he had written, "I won't bother you again." She thought about the baby he had been, the way he curled his fingers around hers, the way he looked at her with unfocused newborn eyes. She thought about the boy he had become, the one who threw baseballs against the garage and kissed her goodnight with his face scrunched up in embarrassment. She did not know where that boy had gone. She did not know if he would ever come back. She sat in the dark, the house empty behind her, the garden wild in front of her, the street quiet and still. She heard the sound of a dog barking somewhere, the distant hum of traffic, the soft creak of the porch swing as she rocked. She did not know what came next. But she was still here. And the house was still here. And the peonies would bloom again in the spring. She did not know if that was enough. She did not know if anything would ever be enough. She did not know if she would ever stop missing Frank, or if she would ever stop loving Gary, or if she would ever understand how the same hands that had built a life could also tear it apart. She sat on the porch swing and she did not have answers. The night was quiet. The stars were coming out. She looked up at them, the same stars Frank had looked at, the same stars that had been there before either of them was born, the same stars that would be there long after the house was gone and the garden was gone and the peonies had stopped blooming. She thought about the ring in the portrait, the ring Frank had won for her at the county fair. She thought about the way it had looked in the drawing, the way it had looked on her finger, the way it had looked in the box she had kept it in for 63 years. She did not know where it was. She did not know if she had lost it. She did not know if she would ever find it. She sat on the porch swing, the night air cool on her face, the house dark and empty behind her, and she thought about the ring, and she thought about the drawing, and she thought about the boy who had been her son. She closed her eyes. She did not know what she would do tomorrow. But she knew the sun would rise, and she knew the garden would be waiting. And she knew somewhere in a city 3 states away her son was alive. And that was something. That was everything. That was nothing at all. She opened her eyes. The porch swing creaked. The night went on.